and the field of historical studies. One of the questions I would ask, basically, of course, is what is the timeline for the topic of the Black Power movement? Clearly, Peniel in his particular work is looking at the 20th century. I definitely think that there are earlier timelines that could be established from the 17th, even until the 19th century. Of course, with the arrival of the first 20 Africans in Jamestown, Virginia. Jamestown, of course, was the first colony to introduce slavery, and we do see some type of resistance being established there. In the 19th century, we certainly do look at, of course, Nat Turner. There was early movements, of course, with David Prosser. If you look at the book of Peter Wood, who's a professor at Duke University, he clearly wrote the book on Black Majority, the Negroes of Colonial South Carolina, and looked at the organizational activities in terms of fighting rebellion in that particular context. We can also see additional episodes through Frederick Douglass, of course, through his writing. The whole legacy and growth of Black abolitionists is another thing that we need to look at, too. In terms of the Civil Rights Movement, which I clearly think is a major movement that, of course, had an impact on Black power, we see basically that there was not only the modern Civil Rights Movement of 1954 to 1965 that focuses on Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, but there were earlier Civil Rights Movement that focused on Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Also, the role of the Black church, I think, is a major institution, of course, that helped to fund what we now know as Black power. And from a philosophical perspective, I think that we need to define what do we mean by Black power. Clearly, many scholars have begun to look at this, and I think basically it is an idea or a philosophy which denotes that Blacks, of course, will define themselves and help to be in control of their own destiny and provide those economic spheres in which they can fund their own movements, as Alan Morris talks about in his book, The Origins of the Civil Rights Movement, Black Communities Organized for Change, in which he argues that the Black church has been the most powerful institution to fund the institution of change, as well as the only institution that African Americans own exclusively without White domination and control. So I think it's another thing we need to look at in terms of course, the whole idea of Black power. You talk about Malcolm X, but I think it's also interesting to talk about Malcolm's father. Of course, basically, who was an individual who was a Black Baptist minister, who, of course, was a strong Black nationalist, and who was killed for his nationalist activities, who I think, in part, helped to shape, of course, Malcolm's philosophy. Also, in the same sense, I think there's other existential implications that we have in the 20th century. The Million Man March that many of us know about, of course, that was a response to Newt Gingrich, Ingrid Whitewell, in which more than 1 million African-American men marched on Washington to have a change in terms of their perception, in terms of class distributions of economic empowerment for African-Americans. I think there's also some philosophical implications that need to be looked at in terms of what we mean by the various camps of African-Americans who have philosophical differences. Are we talking about integrationists like Dr. King? Or are we talking about nationalists like, of course, Malcolm X? I think that Black nationalism is a collectivity and not one political sphere. I think Professor Walton Brown was absolutely correct when she begins to talk about the movements of Garvey and that type. I think it's also true about the Civil Rights Movement. And I think that basically King, as well as Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, and, of course, the Elevator et al., had a collective identity in terms of proposing different change from uplifting African Americans from their status. Finally, I think that we're seeing the aftermath of Black nationalism and Black power in the United States, looking at the implications of the 2008 election, when we have what is perceived as the first legitimate not in terms of their validity, but legitimate in terms of the possibility of being elected, in terms of having a political party to back it, and that is Barack Obama. In terms of seeing the efforts of earlier individuals who began to run for the presidency, whether that be Jesse Jackson, whether that be Al Sharpton, or whether that be Shirley Chisholm, who ran out of New York much earlier. The fact that we see now that we have an African-American, or I should say a president's candidate who happens to be African-American, who's taken very significantly and is a front runner in the Democratic Party, and who has a wide appeal of support by non-African-Americans exclusively, but cross-categorical support from various income levels, I think brings about the equation of the success of the Civil Rights Movement, Black Power movement, and Black nationalism in the United United States today. Thank you very much.
I'm going to stand up here. I don't have quite the power of Dr. Best's voice. Both Dr. Best and our guest, Dr. Peniel Joseph, and also Dr. Walton Brown. Yes, all three have introduced similar topics in terms of understanding the larger context of the civil rights movement and Black power, and all three have helped us to get a definition of Black power and the civil rights movement, and they've emphasized the overlap of those two things. Some of the comments that I make will be kind of connected to Central, and also some things that I remember personally. It was really earth-shattering to hear Stokely Carmichael use the term Black power. Millions of people were in fear because in those days, the very idea of Black attached to people of African descent was unthinkable. Most African Americans and many people who were Euro-Americans preferred to see invisibility, and so the term Negroes or colored. In New Britain, Connecticut, in 2008, I continue to hear African Americans call themselves by that name. Fear shot through their bodies to be identified as Black. So it was really radical in that context. When I think about Central, at one of the public gatherings like this, one of the administrators mentioned that in 1949, that period that Dr. Joseph mentioned as a formative period that would catalyze the 1950s, but at Central, he mentioned there was one student of African descent, one. When I look at this audience, everybody here is really part of the legacy of that Black Power movement. All three presenters mentioned that the movement or movements opened the doors for many other movements. The inclusion of women, the inclusion of students, the grassroots. And so with those thoughts, I want to leave time for questions. Thank you all.
I'd like to invite questions from the audience. Yes.
I was just wondering if the panelists could speak a little bit more on the role of Robert F. Williams in the Black Power movement, and maybe a little bit on the Assata Shakur case. That's it.
In terms of Robert F. Williams, Williams, who I do talk about in my book, he's an NAACP leader. He's kind of, what's interesting about Robert Williams, Williams was an NAACP leader in Monroe, North Carolina, who advocated armed self-reliance in the 1950s in Monroe, North Carolina against white terrorists who were persecuting the Black community. And so sometimes people say, well, Williams was a Black Power activist. I think Williams probably has a foot in both in terms of he's a civil rights militant and he's kind of an early proponent of Black Power. And I think Williams is one of the many people, if we take a deeper look at the 1950s, that we see the 50s, even though at the national level, certainly the civil rights movement is the movement, but there's a parallel movement with no name that even infiltrates aspects of civil rights and organizing. In terms of Assata Shakur is in Cuba in exile, and she was a former Black Panther